So when Jonathan Young asked me to create the artwork for his new album Sea Shanty Metal 2, the initial brief sounded fairly straightforward. He wanted this intimidating pirate character somewhere between a skull and a Davy Jones style sea creature, and visually, it needed to feel connected to the first Sea Shanty Metal album. So initially, I was thinking about this just as album artwork, but then the project started expanding. They wanted to use the character on a pirate flag, then there was talk of coins, merchandise, and other Kickstarter rewards, and they needed versions without the title. And suddenly, this one image had to work in a lot of places that an album cover normally doesn't exist. And that changed the way I approached the whole thing, because a detailed illustration can look great at full size and completely fall apart when you shrink it down to something the size of a coin. So the real challenge became, how much can I put into this without losing the thing that makes it recognizable? The first thing I needed was a shape that worked before any of the detail existed. Jonathan and his team already had a really clear visual identity from the previous album. Black background, center graphic, something that almost feels like it could have been painted onto a pirate flag already. I didn't want to move away from that just for the sake of making the sequel look different. I think it was kind of the opposite. If this is Sea Shanty Metal 2, I want somebody who knows the first album to see this and immediately understand they both belong together. So rather than treating the second cover as a completely new visual direction, I started thinking about what could change inside the same basic design language. And that's where the character became the main difference. The first album had this much simpler skull-based identity. Here the character needed more personality, but I still wanted that same centered, almost emblem-like quality. So even at a rough stage, I was trying to keep everything fairly symmetrical. Not perfectly symmetrical, because that can start feeling sterile, but enough that the silhouette holds together as one symbol. And the tentacles are probably the first place where that started to get difficult, because there's a very obvious temptation with a character like this just to keep adding them. You've got this sea monster pirate, so more tentacles should make him look more impressive. But when I started looking at the smaller version of the image, they very quickly just became noise. You stop seeing individual shapes and just get this mass underneath the face. So I had to think about them less as anatomy and more as just graphic shapes. Which ones are pulling the silhouette outward, and where do I need a gap so you can still read the skull and face? That was much more useful than worrying about whether every tentacle was behaving realistically. And I think that's probably the biggest difference between drawing something as an illustration and designing something that needs to become an emblem. You're constantly checking what survives when the detail disappears. And the skull gave me another problem. Originally, this was just going to be a pirate with a tentacle beard, but Jonathan and his team wanted it to feel more disturbing. So I started bringing more skeletal structures into the nose and the teeth. The nose almost disappears completely, which lets the tentacles kind of feel as though they're growing out of the skull rather than being attached underneath a normal human face. Then the teeth stay very exposed, and that gave me a much stronger central read. If you take away the hat, the compass shape, the colour, most of the tentacles, you'd still kind of recognise the face. And that's important because everything I add after that is essentially competing with it. And there is quite a lot more to add, because the pirate hat was doing more work here than I expected. Obviously it tells you just pirate immediately, which is useful, but it also gives the entire design this really strong triangular top half. Without it, the tentacles make the character very bottom heavy. Once the hat is in there, the silhouette starts balancing itself out. I add the anchor to the front because I wanted one very simple shape sitting right above the face. There are barnacles, scratches and smaller details around it, but the anchor is what I actually want you to recognise. And that became a useful test throughout the piece. Every time I added detail, I kept asking whether it was helping the main shapes or starting to basically compete with them. There's a lot of rendering in this artwork, but I never wanted the detail itself to become the idea. Once the character started working, I still felt like he needed something holding the whole graphic together, and that's where the circular compass element came into it. Because if you look at the character without it, the tentacles and hat have all these different directional shapes pushing away from the center. The circle pulls everything back together and holds it there. It also obviously connects to navigation in the sea, but compositionally, it was probably more important to me than the actual symbolism. It gives the artwork an edge. almost like a badge or a crest, and that suddenly made it much easier to imagine the design somewhere other than an album cover. You could remove the title and put this on a flag, and you could take the character and simplify it further onto a coin. You could drop it onto a shirt. It had started to become an identity rather than just a square illustration, and that was really the point where I knew the concept was working. And colour was another place where I could have made this much more complicated. There's already a lot happening in the drawing, so I kept coming back to this fairly restricted teal, gold and red orange palette. The teal gives the skin this dead underwater quality, and gold pulls out the hat, jewellery and anchor and compass shapes. Then the red and orange are mostly there to introduce the warmth to the overall colour scheme, something that would otherwise feel overall just very cold. The eye became really useful for that. I didn't just want both eyes glowing because I think it would just made the face feel just too balanced. With one eye covered and the other burning through the cooler skin tones, you get a much clearer focal point that just pulls you in. It also gives me a little more character. He's not just a generic monster skull pirate. There's something slightly more specific about him. And once this fiery smoke started coming out of that side of the face, I could use it to break the symmetry without destroying the overall emblem. That was something I kept quite controlled. Most of the design is centered and balanced. Then this one area starts escaping out towards the left. It gives the image a bit more movement while still letting the whole thing work as a static symbol. That balance became important because of the different uses. If this was only ever going to be a digital album cover, I could probably push the atmosphere much further. More smoke, more lighting effects, more background information. But a pirate flag doesn't really care about subtle atmospheric perspective. It needs a strong shape. The title came fairly late because I wanted to know that the illustration worked without it. That was important from the beginning. The words Sea Shanty Metal 2 need to feel integrated when they're there, but the artwork can't only just depend on them. So the type cuts across the lower part of the tentacles without covering the main face, and the Roman numerals sits behind the title, almost like another painted mark. But if Jonathan wants this on merchandise without any wording, nothing essential disappears. That's probably the part of this project I found most useful from a design perspective, because I went into it thinking I was designing an album cover, but by the end I was really designing a visual asset system around one character. And those two things require slightly different thinking. An album cover can reward somebody for looking closely. A shirt needs to work from across the room, and a flag needs a strong silhouette. And a coin might reduce everything down until most of your rendering is gone. The artwork has to survive all of those losses. So when I look at the finished version now, the parts I care about most aren't actually the tiny details. It's the shape of the hat, the skull, the eye patch and the glowing eye, the tentacle silhouettes, the anchor and the circle holding everything together. Because if those still read, the identity survives. And I think that's the bigger lesson I took from this. Detail is useful, especially when somebody sees the artwork at full size. But if the concept only works because of the detail, it's probably more fragile than it looks. With this piece, I wanted somebody to be able to see a tiny version of it and still think sea shanty metal. Then, when they get closer, they can discover all the barnacles, the scratches, texture, tentacles, and smaller bits of rendering. That order feels kind of right to me. The simple idea gets you into the image, and the detail rewards you staying there. And that is the finished artwork for Jonathan Young's Sea Shanty Metal 2. Let me know what you think of the final character, and also kind of where you think this design works best. Is it on an album cover, on a flag, t-shirt, coin, whatever you'd actually want to see it on. I'll put a link to Jonathan's project and the album below, and the Kickstarter. And if you enjoy these videos where I use the process to break down the actual design decisions behind client work, then please subscribe. I've got quite a few more pieces like this that I can finally start showing. And if you are an artist trying to build a professional career around your work, my book, The Profitable Artist, covers things like positioning, portfolios, pricing, and working with clients. And the link to that is in the description below. And as always, thank you for watching.